Ignatius Press and the Augustine Institute present the Formed Book Club. Catholic book lovers unpacking good books, chapter by chapter. If you like us, please help us by subscribing and by reviewing us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you might listen. And don't forget to sign up for weekly updates and study questions at formedbookclub.ignatius.com.
Welcome back to the Formed Book Club with Joseph Pierce, Vivian Duder, and myself, Father Fescio. We continue to discuss Susan Treacy's The Music of Christendom, and we are going to begin with chapter 22, The Russians, 19th century, but I'm going to actually go back a couple of chapters as a remark. I am saddened that I did not think about this a lot earlier, and that is that very worthwhile, since Susan Treacy will take a couple of key pieces, by these composers throughout the history. And in the back, she has this list of the 100 things we should all know as Catholics. But I did last week what I should have suggested we do from the beginning. Namely, I picked one or two pieces of what we discussed or would be discussing and went to YouTube. And it's a marvelous resource. So, for example, Joseph, I think last week we talked about Wagner, and you mentioned the fact you thought Parsifal was probably your favorite classical piece. So I went to YouTube and I got Parsifal actually recorded at Bayreuth, which is, the ground zero for Richard Wagner and all his works. And it's 3 hours and 52 minutes, but it's a wonderful, wonderful piece of music. And I wonder, after watching that, I can see why Nietzsche disengaged from Wagner after that. Do you think that he ended his life as a Christian, or was he simply using Christian imagery to find a musical theme or something like that?
Well, Susan Treacy quotes a late letter from Wagner as an old man to King Ludwig, where he says that it shines forth the truth of Christianity, or words to that effect. So I think that I would say that Wagner died, certainly at the very least, as a fellow traveller. And I think, to be charitable, we'd have to say he died as a Christian, at least according to his own understanding of it. Obviously no one's going to say that he died a Catholic or somebody who's completely authentically Orthodox. But the point is, for someone who was so hostile to Christianity for the bulk of his life, that significant revolutionary turn in the right direction at the end, that has to be something we can all be edified by.
And what encourages me is that is still a very popular piece of music among people who love classical music. And how can you watch that for 3 hours and 52 minutes and not begin thinking about the Savior and his blood and the chalice of the Spirit and so on?
Yeah, I've actually got that. Believe it or not, I've got that on VCR, and it breaks my heart that I now have no way of watching it. The whole performance, and I've seen it once or twice. In the old days when you had VCR recorders, but just go to
YouTube. It's on YouTube. Put Wagner Parsifal in there, you'll have it.
The whole video of it?
Oh yes.
Oh wow. Okay.
Yes. And with subtitles and everything.
Maybe it's the same one that I had. It was beautiful, and it was by Royth, yeah.
I watched Mahler's Second Symphony, The Resurrection, and it's also quite long as a symphony. It's an hour and 30-something minutes, and for the first hour and so, I'm saying, well, I don't believe anybody could just listen to his music and say, this is about the resurrection. But then at the end, the last 10, 15 minutes, he's got this poem by Stockman or something, but then he himself, Mahler, wrote the rest of the poem, and it's very, very beautiful. And what's wonderful and I'll say this to everybody who probably already knows it, but I just learned it as an old age, but when you go to the internet and watch these things, when they're properly videographed, like the symphony was, this was conducted by Maurice Janssen, and he was absolutely phenomenal, but the camera work, every time you'd hear the percussion, boom, would go and show you the drums. And then when the oboe came in, boom, it showed the oboe player. So you actually saw up close who's playing this, who's playing that, how does it fit into the into the whole symphony? And obviously, Vivian, I agree with what I'm sure you're going to say, that you can't duplicate the experience of actually being in a symphony hall, being present, even if you're in the last row. But I'll tell you, for someone who can't always do that or doesn't have the time or whatever, the internet is a great resource. And I'm just sorry I didn't think about this before we started. So now we go to chapter 22, Russians. And in this chapter, we talk about, this question in Russia of they wanted to progress. They wanted, therefore, to kind of imitate or assimilate some of the Western European practices in industry and finance and also in art and culture. But then there was a resistance where they wanted to know, we want to have our own Russian music. And there was so-called the Five, and it says on page 177, the central figure in the Mugache Kucha, which was the Five, was Modest Mussorgsky, and so on. And I watched on the internet pictures at an exhibition, and again, it was wonderful to watch, but I couldn't tell any difference between that and whatever Western music was. It seemed like just good music to me. That's all I have to offer.
Yeah, I mean, I want to just make a few clarifications at the beginning of this. I think are important because there are different types of nationalism here, and it's very important we don't get them confused. Because the American Revolution, all right, that's a nationalism where a colony breaks away from the motherland or the empire, whatever you call it. The French Revolution was basically an ideological secularist revolution against both the rich and the church. But, some forms of nationalism are actually imperialism. So the French Revolution gave birth after the Reign of Terror to Napoleon. And to French imperialism. And imperialism is a form of internationalism when you actually march across other people's nations. So it's very, very important. A British nationalism is actually imperialism. It's honouring the empire. As opposed to Scottish nationalism, which wants independence for the Scottish nation from the British Empire. So it's very important to distinguish. So if you're interested here, American Revolution and the French Revolution are, of course, very, very different. We discussed that at length when we discussed Robert Riley's book. But Czech and Polish nationalism is an authentic grassroots. We want to be Czech. We don't want to be part of either the
Austro-Hungarian or
Austro-Hungarian Empire, or in the case of Poland, we don't want to be part of Russia. We don't want to be part of Germany. So there's this authentic. We want to just be ourselves. We have our own roots. So it's very important, I think, to distinguish between these different types of nationalism. And then to your point about the Russian aristocracy, the Russian monarchy. Becoming very westernized, particularly France. They've been very enamored of France, especially. There's an irony there, of course, because the Russian Revolution was a Western import. Karl Marx was born in Germany. He did most of his writing in Britain during the time of the Empire, and it was because of this besottedness, if that's the right word, of Russia towards the West, that they actually imported the Russian Revolution. So there's all sorts of mix in this, which I think we need to distinguish. Distinguishing what is nationalism, what is imperialism, and what is Russian, because there would be a certain type of Russian nationalist that say that the Russian Revolution was not Russian, but was actually a Western import.
Yeah, well, when Napoleon overran Czechoslovakia, there was a refugee who got into Switzerland, and he said, "Can you cash a small check?" CACHE.
Very good.
Vivian, we haven't heard from you.
I was. Thank you, Joseph, for those making those distinctions. Those are important distinctions whenever the word nationalism is used. That discernment's always needed when language can be used to mean different things, and sometimes intentionally so, to obscure things for other people's ends. So thank you for that. And I was my main disappointment with this chapter is that she ends on Tchaikovsky, and it ends so abruptly. She doesn't even discuss Tchaikovsky's ballets, right? And I think that for a lot of Americans, especially who associate Christmas time with the Nutcracker, that's kind of the avenue a lot of people find Tchaikovsky, and his ballet is his ballets are a huge part of the ballet repertoire that gets performed in America every year. So I was a little disappointed by that.
I agree. In the 1812 overture, particularly, she begins the chapter about a discussion of nationalism. I mean, that's very, overtly Russian nationalism against the Napoleonic invasion of Russia in 1812. Yeah, I got the impression, I'd like to ask her, actually, from reading this, that she doesn't like Tchaikovsky. I don't know if that's true, but you really get this impression that she's giving him scant praise. She's sort of going through
either that or she was given a limit on how long the book could be, and she had to cut some of the chapters, because I sort of get that feeling of abrupt endings before. But hey, you can't put everything in a book like this, right? There's so much you could be including, and you just can't include it all. But I happen to be
much more charitable than I was there. Bravo to you.
We try, but I happen to love Tchaikovsky, both his ballets and his other kinds of music. And it was interesting to learn of how these various influences, the Western European, the ethnic Russian, and so on, kind of found an intersection in Tchaikovsky, actually.
Yes, and also on your previous point, or maybe Joseph's, I forget that. I mean, when you're talking about wonderful music, and there's so much of it that everyone's going to have his or her preferences, and so no one will read someone else's list and say, that's exactly the perfect list.
Right.
But it's certainly it's like reading a good book. Whenever you read good books, I'm not talking about fiction now, but nonfiction, you always want to read more books. I mean, they refer to this person, that person, and if you start listening to some of this music, you're going to go beyond what's here on this list, because you're going to say, oh, well, I want to hear what that sounds like,
Right.
Good. France from the Belle Epoque through World War I.
This is just such an interesting period in France. It's just amazing to me that there was so much undercurrent of the faith in spite of the fierce anti-clericalism, the fierce secularization ever since the revolution, the embrace of modern science and technology, and all this stuff is going, the Eiffel Tower is going up, all this stuff is going on, and yet this undercurrent of, well, you've always said, Father, France was the first daughter of the church.
That's not. I've said that, but it's not true.
Oh, it's not?
Armenia actually, before the 4th century, became a Catholic nation, but France is considered, the fille aînée de l'Église, the eldest daughter of the church.
Maybe, as far as Western continental Europe is concerned.
Yeah, for sure.
But nevertheless, I'm always, and this now, we're going to see this off and on until the very end of the book now. These French people, these French musicians straddling this fence and being influenced, and how important the monks of Salem are in this period, and how that ended up influencing modern musical composition. I mean, I really was fascinated by these chapters here going forward. That
I think there is I think something very encouraging about this, because we find ourselves perhaps today in what we consider to be very dark times, but the French Revolution is about as dark as it gets. And when you get something that plummets the depths, there's always a healthy reaction to it. And in the mid to late 19th century, there was a Catholic cultural revival in France, which was largely a reaction and a recoil from, reaction against and a recoil from the French Revolution and the secularism and laïcité and the rest of it. So, I think what we see here in this chapter is that healthy reaction to the darkness.
And we saw
Yes.
it not just in music, but also in art and culture. You got Péguy and Claudel,
Yes.
and the poets.
Yes.
French Catholic culture was very rich. In the very midst, as you say, of the secularization. For example, the Jesuits were expelled from France in the early 1900s. Probably not a bad idea, but they actually had to go to the Isle of Wight or Hastings in England, and that's where they had their formation, because they couldn't have any houses in France.
So some of these key players, Fauré and Debussy, and it's just there's so many. This is a very rich chapter. But one thing that really cracked me up on page 186.
Yeah.
She writes, during this era, French musicians had an interest in the ancient style, that is, music of the 17th and 18th centuries. This was associated with their desire to distance themselves from the overblown emotional style of late romantic German composers. And you just have to chuckle, that ages-long, conflict between the French and the Germans. And here it is again, right?
There's a couple of things there, and that's completely correct. I mean, first of all, I always talk about the fact that cultural movements are always playing leapfrog over the previous one and rediscovering the one before it. And so there's this sort of dialogue. So there's certainly a case of that there, but you're completely correct. This is immediately after the Franco-Prussian War, right? I mean, insofar as the French are going to be nationalists at all at this point, they're going to be anti-German, and the Germans have just invaded them and besieged Paris and all that went with that. So it's not surprising that they were seeking something which was French and prior to German Romanticism. I've got a couple of comments on this chapter, if I may, because it's really the sort of the connections between the various different types of culture, because Fauré, for instance, setting Paul Verlaine's Clair de Lune poems and other poems. So Paul Verlaine was a so-called decadent symbolist poet who converted to Catholicism. And so the fact that Fauré is setting some of these poems by this convert poet, I found interesting. Debussy, of course, also set that same poem by Paul Verlaine, Clair de Lune, to music. And then we have on page 185, Susan Treacy saying that Debussy's tone poem, Prélude à l'après d'un faun, Prelude to the Afternoon of a Faun, heralded the modern era in classical music, which she says is a musical style dubbed Impressionism, in emulation of the style of painting. So you can see this sort of, I don't know if it's intertextual, I don't know what the word would be, intercultural, intergenre, I don't know, but how these composers are inspired by literature and by the visual arts, as well as by politics and nationalism in what they're actually composing.
But so I had a question mark on that expression on 185 there, with respect to Debussy. As a composer, he heralded the modern era in classical music. What does that mean, the modern era in classical music? I mean,
well, she gives it. I think she gives the descriptions down here where it's called dub Impressionism, in emulation of the style of painting. And I am perplexed by this as well, because the Impressionists are admired for their atmospheric paintings. The same could be said of musical impressionists, but in this case, the small brushstrokes are colourful harmonies that do not follow traditional progressions. If you take Chesterton's definition of impressionism, that basically it's relativism because it lacks definition. I mean, that's what impressionism is, right? Everything blurs, so you get the impression, you don't get the definition. Musical impressionism strikes me as the opposite, because what it's trying to do is to evoke definite images in sound. So in other words, it's trying to bring something which is definitely visual by using music, whereas the Impressionists were taking something visual and blurring it, just so that becomes subliminal rather than.
Okay, well, I guess
defined.
that new paragraph on 185 kind of says what you just said. Debussy is often cited as the first modern composer because of his strikingly new use of harmony and rhythm, which combined to produce a musical style dubbed Impressionism, an emulation of the style of painting. Okay, well, I guess what got me was harmony and rhythm. So it's a new use of, but I mean, I'm a Beethoven man. You know, you want to find harmony and rhythm? I mean, plus melody. You know, it didn't start with Debussy, but I see here where it's more impressionistic. It's probably
and
not.
the middle of the page, Father, goes into technical language that I don't understand. But that's where she talks about what Debussy's doing, which is different and would have actually been unacceptable. So he also allowed chordal movement of parallel fourths and fifths, an unacceptable sound in 19th century harmony. Now, I don't know what that means.
Okay.
but she's sort of explaining there exactly why what Debussy's doing is new or innovative or controversial.
Okay, that makes sense. It's pretty clear here. All right, on to.
I just want to say, not that the Impressionists need to be defended by me, but part of that movement was inspired by the advent of modern photography, and so now people were turning toward photographic portraiture and so on. And so part of what the Impressionists were doing were kind of carving out a new way of painting that would be different from the hyper-realism of photography. And, it isn't relativistic, like from some kind of a moral standpoint or something like that. Anyway, I love the Impressionists, and I'm sure a lot of other people do too.
I do too, by the way, Avina. I don't want you to think that I'm endorsing carte blanche what Chesterton says about the Impressionists.
Yeah, I mean, Chesterton can get kind of cheeky about things and, overstate things to make a point, right?
Also, his favourite artists were definitely realists or not impressionists, and he was also recording and reacting against the decadent movement of the 1890s, which he experienced firsthand in the Slade School of Art. So for him, anything which smacked of that was something to recoil from. So he has his own reasons, but that's why you have to disengage, someone's subjective perception of something from that which is, in the bigger picture, objectively applicable.
Right. But here's the other thing that's innovative about Debussy. He was fascinated by non-Western scales. And yet at the same time, he was interested in Gregorian chant because of the Abbey of Salem. So, these as we've pointed out many times, these artistic movements, philosophical movements, they're all mixing together, and here truly genius musicians and composers, they're doing experimental things, artists too. I think it's all wonderful.
It's Catholic with a small c, but it's also inspired by Catholic with a large C, as you mentioned, like the Salem. Let's go back to the Russians, 20th century. Rachmaninoff.
This too is a very interesting period because we have the introduction of the communist regime, especially the Stalin era, which was just so brutal in purging the party and oh my heavens, all the people who suffered under that regime. And so interesting how she picks these musicians and goes a little bit in terms of their relationship with their era in Russia. So that was interesting.
Yes, about the ones that stayed, and the ones that emigrated.
And like Rachmaninoff emigrated, ended up living in exile. She just has to touch very briefly. Each of these men just live absolutely fascinating and really painful lives. And she just has to sort of touch lightly on them. Stravinsky and also, of course, Prokofiev. I always kind of slur that by mistake. But one thing I want to say about Prokofiev, the section on that, and maybe you'll want to go back to talk on the others, but this Alexander Nevsky, this is the first mention now of one of these great composers actually writing a score for a film. I think it's kind of like we're crossing a threshold now, because of course a lot of the emigre composers and musicians who had to flee Europe during World War II, a lot of them found work in Hollywood, writing musical scores. And here we have Prokofiev writing the score for Alexander Nevsky. Now, you want to talk about an anti-Catholic work. Watch that movie. It's Alexander Nevsky was a real person. He was a Russian prince who repelled an invasion of Russia by the Teutonic Knights. And the Teutonic Knights in the film are equated with the Roman Church, the cruelty, the brutality, of the knights is linked with the church, with priests blessing them as they're throwing babies onto a fire and this kind of thing. I mean, it's really like, oh my goodness. And it was really a propaganda film, because at this time, this film was made in 1938. And that's when the rise of Nazism in Germany, Stalin and the Nazis were, but what's so funny is a year later, they signed the non-aggression pact so that they could carve up Poland. And, so anyway, but I just thought this was like, wow, we really are crossing into a threshold with now music compositions for film. And
also the irony of a propaganda film by Stalin about throwing babies onto a bonfire in the middle of the purges and the killing of tens of millions of people, and blaming this sort of brutality on the church. I mean, you couldn't make it up.
Right. It was meant to fire up the people against Germans, and because I'm sure at this point Stalin's thinking that Hitler intends to invade Germany, which we know he did. Not till much later, but he certainly did. And of course, all the Nazi propaganda against the Slavs and all the rest of it. So it was to churn up Russian nationalism, patriotism, and anti-German feeling. And it just so happened that anti-German and Roman Catholicism, they were linked together. So it's very, any case, but just this, like, we're crossing into an era, right? We're crossing into a new era where great composers are making film scores. Anyway.
Yeah, and I would like to backtrack a bit if I can.
Yeah,
I want
to
talk about page 191 and make a recommendation. The father, began with recommending we go to YouTube, and I'm guessing you can find this on YouTube too. But Stravinsky's third ballet was The Rite of Spring, Le Sacre du Printemps, and that, when it was premiered in Paris, caused a riot. So the actual fact that a work of classical music being premiered can literally cause a riot. The reason for it can be seen here. I'm going to read the last few sentences of this page. The ballet's climax is a human sacrifice in which the chosen one, a teenage girl, dances herself to death. The scenario's topic was not polite, nor was Stravinsky's music, as the young composer sought to shock with musical innovations. So I'm sort of thinking later, maybe my generation, the punk rock music is sort of about shock value. Brutal rhythms with accents occurring in unexpected places over relentless rhythmic pulsations, clashing harmonies that juxtapose two different keys simultaneously, repetitious melodic figures, ostinatos, and no traditional form or development. Instead, Stravinsky simply presented discrete masses of sound that are repeated seemingly randomly. Although the music is not atonal, it is not in any key, rather it is on a key, revolving around one prominent note that is sometimes called neotonality. Now, what I want to mention here, and I would suggest that people check this out, there is a wonderful poem by Siegfried Sassoon called Concert Interpretation, Le Sacre du Printemps. In other words, and it's about his attending a concert of the Rite of Spring by Stravinsky in about 1922, so only about 8 years after the riot in Paris. And of course, Sassoon has come back from World War One, where he's seen real horror in the trenches. And it's a great satirical poem against the bourgeoisie. In other words, you riot over this basically bourgeois piece of music that 8 years later, when it becomes fashionable, you'll all be clapping politely at the end, which is what happened, of course, at the concert he was at. In other words, this so-called revolution is nothing for people that have experienced real suffering and real horror. It's a great satirical poem, just called Concert Interpretation by Siegfried Sassoon, and I'm guessing you can find it either on YouTube, or certainly if you just Google the title, you'll find it in poetry, in the various poetry sites where you can read it or have it recited.
The other interesting thing is that, how it says here, the human sacrifice, it's a ballet, and the human sacrifice, the girl dances herself to death. Well, according to professional dancers I've talked to, Stravinsky, it's practically you dance to death trying to dance to him. And when you just read the description of the music, imagine trying to dance ballet to music like that. It's brutal in comparison to like the Tchaikovsky ballets, where everything is written so that bodies can dance gracefully to it. It's almost made for the dancer. In this work by Stravinsky, from what I understand, he didn't have concern for the dancers at all. It's horrible to dance to it. And I've never seen it because of its reputation. It's been performed in places where I could have seen it. I just had no interest.
It's the aesthetic, of course, of it. You compare it to Tchaikovsky's ballets. It's ugliness. In other words, it's the cult of ugliness. We don't want this grace. We don't want this beauty. We don't want this symmetry any longer. We want violence. We want brutality. Yes. We want ugliness.
But then the beautiful thing on the next page, in 1924, Stravinsky returned to the Russian Orthodox faith, and I was shocked he was encouraged by Jacques Maritain.
Yeah, that I've got that highlighted. Well, that surprised me as well. Yeah,
I was just floored by that.
Yeah.
Well, I like the fact that in the middle of page 192 that the French libretto for Stravinsky is by Jean Cocteau, but Stravinsky had it translated into Latin by Father Jean Danielou, SJ.
Yeah, I saw that too. I mean, again, it's good. I mean, I love it. He does a symphony of psalms, obviously from scripture, and then an opera oratorio on Oedipus Rex, Sophocles' marvelous play cycle, of course. So, yeah, I mean, I just love the way that the good, the true, and the beautiful communicate with each other, right? You have music, you have the visual arts, you have literature, and they communicate with each other. It's wonderful.
Well, I'd say let us finish this wonderful book next week, starting with chapter 25. And the week after that, we are going to take Augustine's City of God, abridged by von Balthasar and selected. And we're going to take the introduction and the first section, the meaning of creation. But I have a little footnote question here, which may take us longer than we should spend on it. But why are there so few women composers? Have we had one yet?
I'm going to defer to Vivian.
There have been some women composers, and I'm trying to wear my big girl pants and not be offended by the question.
Well, it's just a factual question. I mean,
it is a factual question. I agree. It is a factual question. The closest thing a man can come to giving birth to a child is genius, where the receptivity that takes place in a genius, whether it's producing art, music, or whatever, philosophy, high mathematics. I mean, there are rare women who achieve greatness in these fields, but let's face it, it's mostly men. And I just equate it with, women are mothers and men are geniuses, and I'm okay with it. But I'm sure there are a lot of people who would be upset with me.
Okay, I think women are geniuses too. Here's an interesting thing in Scandinavia, where they've really tried to eliminate any sexual preferences for whatever you want to do in your life. Still today, 80% of nurses are women and 80% of engineers are men.
And there are differences in the brain.
Exactly.
I mean, as much as they try to push women into STEM and tech and all these things, the level of abstraction that's required for high mathematics, philosophy, high music, and these things. I mean, I think if people were honest, they really would find biological differences between the way men and women are made. And it has something to do with what they're made for, and this is a very politically incorrect thing to say, so people don't say it, even though a lot of us know it's true. And so long as you don't mean any kind of a slight, Father, in asking the question, I welcome the question.
Yeah, no. In fact,
can I
go ahead,
can I
Joseph?
Yeah, maybe comment upon it as well. Just a couple of comments, and then I'll keep it brief. But that when I originally did my poetry anthology, which was Ignatius published, it was originally published by Hodder and Staunton in England, Flowers of Heaven, 1,000 Years of Christian Verse. Hodder and Staunton insisted I put more female poets in it because they weren't enough, and I said, well, I selected on the basis of merit. I haven't been sexist, so I put lots of basically inferior poetry in to placate them, and I took most of those out. One or two I discovered one or two I did miss. Took most of those out. So you can say what you said about music, you could say about poetry largely, but you couldn't say it about the novel, right?
That's right.
Some of the greatest novelists who've ever lived are women. Jane Austen might be the greatest novelist who ever lived.
And the key difference,
Sigrid Undset, and we could carry on.
Yes, and the key difference I would say is that style of writing, that genre, lends itself to an interest in the human person.
And the concrete. Yes.
Which is more in keeping with the telos of a woman. We are more, like you said about women going into nursing and things like that. I mean, we are more geared toward the care of the person, which requires observation of the person and so on, and less geared toward the more abstract forms of thinking. I just think it's nature.
I almost have to recant up to a point, however, in the sense that I edit the St. Austin Review, a magazine, and today I've had poetry submitted by two separate women poets that are absolutely superb. And I get lots of great poetry submitted by good Catholic women poets. So, I have no idea why the canon over the centuries has had relatively few women poets, but I might recant in the sense that I see a great deal of great poetry by contemporary Catholic female poets.
Right.
I don't know. It's the answer I don't know.
So you've got the nature side of the thing, but then you also have the nurture side of the thing. And let's face it, in various eras, historical eras, women were not educated. Some were, especially like the members of the nobility. Of course, that was true for the men too, members of the nobility versus everybody else. But I'm just saying that there is both nature and nurture. But it's just interesting now that with all of the emphasis on putting women forward in math and science, trying to get them into engineering and all the rest, guess what? Those are still male-dominated fields. And I don't think it's because of sexism. I think there are natural differences. You don't want to make it too much of a general rule because there are always the outliers. But is all this being recorded? Because
boys like Legos, or when I was Tinker Toys when I was a boy, we like to build little things, and girls right away want a doll. That's not
for the most part.
Pardon me.
There's always the exceptions.
It's like a bell curve. Like men are more aggressive than women. What does that mean? It means on a bell curve, you get people who are really aggressive and not very aggressive among men and women. But the curves are shifted. So if you go out on the end of the bell curve for the most aggressive, they're all men. That's why they're in jail.
Right. Well, and again, that goes with their telos. I mean, men are supposed to be the protectors. So all that testosterone and that aggressiveness and everything, it's there for a reason. It's supposed to be channeled in the right direction, of course. But, I mean, some of this just is common sense as far as I can see.
Yeah, but that's been lost. Okay. Very good. Well, you have the last.
Father, you've turned this evening's this week's recording into an academic thing, because the footnote is about a third the length of the whole.
Yeah. All right. We'll be back next week to conclude this book. Thank you, but don't leave, Joseph. God bless you all.
If you enjoyed this discussion, please help spread the word about the Forum Book Club by subscribing to the podcast and writing a review. You can sign up for weekly updates at forumbookclub.ignatius.com.